I was stacking folding chairs when the city representative cleared his throat and the sound cut through the room like a dropped glass. Parents turned at once. Children in red sweaters and paper crowns froze mid-wiggle, and he did not look at any of them when he spoke. He looked at me, his voice calm and practiced as he said, "Funding has been cut. This program ends tonight," and the words landed without anger, which somehow made them crueler. No apology, no explanation. Just a sentence that closed a door while the smell of cocoa and pine still hung in the air. I nodded because someone had to, because 20 children were already dressed for a concert that had taken weeks of borrowed time and donated patience, because the room still believed in itself. I told everyone we would continue as planned, that it would be a good night, and I lied with a steady voice. While inside, I was already packing boxes. Teachers guided the children into place. Parents clapped too loudly, and the piano waited at the front of the room with its lid closed and bench centered as if it still believed it had a future here. Lucy slipped her hand from her teacher and walked toward the piano, and I took one step forward to stop her. Not because she was wrong, but because moments like this became complaints, because the city man was still watching, because endings made people sharp. Her teacher was close enough to reach her, but Lucy climbed onto the bench anyway and turned to face the room with the calm of someone who had never learned fear, sir. She said softly, "I learned this song from my mommy." And before I could speak, the first notes rang out, careful and uneven and human, and I stopped moving. I did not hear the audience or the city man. I heard the space between notes and the way the melody bent, then returned as if asking a question and waiting. My breath caught and my hands went cold because that song did not belong here. It did not belong to a room that could be shut down with a sentence. It belonged to a summer I had buried and a promise I had stopped naming. I wrote it once for a man who left. Lucy missed a note and recovered, and the mistake made it unmistakable. No one else knew that turn. No one else would choose it. I had never played it in public or written it down. I looked up and saw him standing at the back near the exit sign, older and thinner and completely still. His hands clenched like he was holding something that could slip. He was not watching. Lucy, he was watching the past arrive. For a moment, the room existed twice. The children and lights layered over another place where time had not kept its promises. The song ended, and applause came late and gentle. Lucy hopped down and smiled like she had done nothing unusual. I could not make my feet move. The city representative checked his watch, and the man at the back met my eyes for the first time. He did not smile or step forward. He looked like someone who had finally found the right door and was afraid to touch it, and I realized this was not coincidence or nostalgia, but a reckoning that had chosen the worst possible night. If he spoke, the room would tilt, and if I spoke, I might not stop. So I stayed where I was while the piano hummed as if it remembered my hands. Why was he here, and why tonight? And why did my heart feel like it had been waiting? I thought of the children who would wake tomorrow to a closed door and a flyer folded into a backpack. I thought of the way Lucy trusted the room to hold her song. I thought of the man by the exit who once promised to stay and did not. The lights warmed the wood floor. Parents whispered plans they did not yet believe. The city man waited for me to nod again, and I felt the old instinct to smooth things over and move on collide with the newer instinct to stand still. The song had chosen its witness, and the night had chosen its question, and I knew whatever came next would not be managed or postponed or quietly filed away. It would have to be answered. I kept my hands at my sides and counted the seconds between breaths somewhere behind me. A child laughed, and somewhere in front of me a future waited, and I did not know which would ask me to choose first. Only that tonight would not forgive hesitation or silence anymore. I did not listen to the applause or the scraping of chairs. I watched him, because my body already knew what my mind was still refusing, the way he stood with his shoulders held too tight, the way his jaw locked as if any movement might crack him open. Lucy looked proud and unafraid, waving at her teacher as she returned to her seat, but the song lingered in the room like breath on glass. I knew that melody, the way you know a scar by touch alone, and seeing it leave a child's hands and land in his chest made my stomach twist. He had not heard that song in years. I could see it in the way his eyes searched the floor as if grounding himself. Lucy had played it wrong in places, her fingers hesitating before finding their way back, but that only made it worse, because perfection would have felt borrowed. This was alive. This was real. This was the version that grows when it is passed from one heart to another. I felt heat climb my neck and shame follow close behind. Shame that I had written something so fragile and then hidden it. Shame that it was finding him now. When I had no defenses left, I had spent years telling myself that what was unfinished could stay that way, that some things did not need closure to survive. But the truth was standing at the back of the room with his hands clenched and his eyes wet, and I knew he was hearing not just the notes, but the night I wrote them, the promise we made that felt impossible. Even then, I remembered the sound of summer cicadas and the way we laughed at our own certainty. I remembered thinking that love could be postponed without consequence, and I hated that memory for surviving me when Lucy's teacher leaned down to whisper praise. Lucy nodded as if she had done her job, and the innocence of that gesture nearly broke me. I turned away first because I needed air, because the room felt too small for the years that had just returned. I reached for the piano lid and closed it with a careful hand. The instrument went quiet in a way that felt like respect behind me. Parents gathered coats and children tugged sleeves. The city representative waited with his clipboard patient. Now that the damage had been done, I nodded again because habit is a powerful thing, because endings ask for signatures, and still I did not move toward him. I could feel his presence like a held breath, and I hated that part of myself that still recognized it. I told myself that he was just another person in a public room, that whatever we had ended when he left, but the lie slid off me without sticking. I felt anger rise and then falter, because anger requires a target, and he looked like a man who had been standing in the rain too long. The applause faded into small conversations, and then Lucy's voice cut through everything as she walked back toward me. She stopped short and tilted her head, her curiosity gentle and unguarded. "Do you know that song?" She asked her question simple and clean, and the room seemed to lean in. I swallowed because the truth pressed against my teeth. I said it was an old one. I said it belonged to someone else, and even as I spoke, I felt him flinch. Lucy nodded as if that made sense. "Songs travel," she said, and the certainty in her voice felt like a verdict. The city man cleared his throat again and reminded me of forms and timelines, but Lucy was still looking at me waiting. I wanted to tell her that songs carry the weight of who they were written for, that they remember even when people pretend not to. I wanted to tell her that leaving does not erase what was promised, but children do not need burdens to be honest. They need space. So I smiled and thanked her for playing. She accepted the praise and turned away, and that was when I felt the past settle fully into the present. He stepped forward, one pace, and stopped as if checking an invisible line. He did not say my name. He did not say anything at all. And that restraint did more damage than an apology would have. I realized then that I was frozen not by surprise, but by recognition, because some part of me had been waiting for this moment without permission. Waiting to see if he would cross the room or respect the distance I had learned to keep the room emptied until there were only a few parents and the staff. The piano sat closed and quiet, and the air felt heavy with things unsaid. I knew that if I spoke first, I would choose anger, and if he spoke first, he would choose regret, and neither would change what the song had already done. It had reopened a door. I had sealed with routine and responsibility. It had reminded me that unfinished things do not decay. They wait. I felt my hands tremble and pressed them together. I told myself that I did not owe him an explanation or an audience, that the program ending tonight was not my fault, and his presence did not give him a claim. But another truth moved beneath that one, quieter and harder to dismiss. I could not pretend this was nothing, because nothing does not make your chest ache like this. Nothing does not arrive with a child's voice and a melody you never let go of. I looked back once more and met his eyes, and in that glance I saw the same realization taking shape. Not relief or triumph, but the weight of an unfinished past that had finally found its witness, and I knew the question was no longer whether I could avoid him. It was whether I was willing to face what the song had carried back into the room. Lucy did not seem to notice the tension that settled after the applause faded. She moved through it the way children do without fear and without permission. She came back toward the piano with her program folded too many times, humming under her breath as if the room still belonged to her. I watched her because it was easier than watching him, because her presence felt clean, where everything else felt weighted. She stopped a few feet from me and looked up with a seriousness that did not belong to her age. My mommy says, "Songs remember people," she said, and I felt something tighten because that was not something a child invents. That was something handed down carefully, like a fragile dish wrapped in cloth. I asked her where she learned that, and she shrugged. Like it was obvious Mommy taught me, she said she told me this one was for someone who left. The words landed with the precision of a needle, not cruel but exact, and I realized then what children do so effortlessly. They speak the truth without choosing sides. They mirror what adults try to hide. I nodded and thanked her again, my voice thinner than I wanted. Lucy tilted her head and asked a question that should have been harmless. Do songs get lonely when people leave the room? Went quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if it had decided to listen. I opened my mouth and nothing came out, because there are questions you can answer and questions that answer you. I had spent years avoiding that one, shaping my life around its edges, and now it was standing in front of me with untied shoes and curious eyes. I felt him move closer, not rushing, not claiming space, just enough to be present. He stopped at a respectful distance and waited, and that waiting told me more than any speech could have. He did not interrupt or correct her. He did not look at me to rescue him from the moment he let the question sit where it belonged. Lucy looked between us, sensing something but not naming it, and I understood that she was not asking for a lesson. She was asking for honesty. I told her that songs feel what we give them, that they can hold joy and loss at the same time, and that they do not disappear, just because people do. She nodded as if filing that away for later satisfied, not because the answer was complete, but because it was real. That was when he finally spoke. "Thank you for letting her play," he said, his voice steady and careful. He did not say my name. He did not mention the past. He thanked me as if I had done him a kindness rather than reopened a wound, and that restraint unsettled me, because apologies are familiar, they follow rules, restraint requires intention. Lucy smiled at him and offered a small wave. He returned it with a gentleness that felt practiced and hard-won. I saw then that whatever he had carried into the room was heavy and old, and that he was trying not to set it down on anyone else. Lucy asked if she could come back next week to practice. And before I could answer, he looked at me again, this time with a question in his eyes rather than his mouth. I felt the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, not just for the program or the children, but for the boundaries that keep people safe. I told Lucy that the schedule would be posted soon, that we would see, and she accepted that with the patience of someone used to waiting. She ran off to find her teacher, leaving the space between us filled with things unsaid. He stayed where he was, hands relaxed now, shoulders still tense but no longer locked. I realized then that he was not here to reclaim anything. He was here to witness what had survived him. The city representative approached to discuss logistics, and I answered automatically. My mind split between the present and the echo of Lucy's question. When the conversation ended and the room thinned further, he stepped forward. One small pace. "I would like to hear her practice sometime if that is allowed," he said. No urgency, no expectation, just a request shaped like respect. I surprised myself by considering it, by weighing the safety of the space against the truth of the moment. Children learn from what adults model, and Lucy had just modeled courage without knowing it. I told him that practice hours were public and supervised, that there were rules. He nodded immediately and thanked me. Relief passed across his face so briefly I might have imagined it, but the child had not. Lucy glanced back and grinned as if she had accomplished something important. I watched her disappear down the hall and understood the role she had played without intending to. She had held up a mirror and forced us both to look not at who we were, but at who we had been avoiding becoming. As the lights dimmed and the piano rested closed, I felt the night settle into a new shape, not resolved, not softened, but honest. The kind of honesty that does not accuse or forgive. It simply exists, waiting to see what will be done with it. The next time he came, I was ready with rules because readiness is a shield, and I needed one. The schedule was taped to the glass, and the door was unlocked for public hours only. Parents drifted in and out, teachers checked attendance, and I stood near the desk with a clipboard that made me feel official. He paused at the threshold and waited for my nod before stepping inside. That pause mattered more than I wanted to admit. It told me he understood where lines lived. Now I told him the conditions in a voice meant for policy. Not memory, practice sessions were open and supervised. No private lessons. No one-on-one time. No lingering after closing, and any gifts or materials had to go through the center. He listened without interrupting and agreed without bargaining. The ease of his acceptance unsettled me because it removed my anger's leverage. He chose a chair at the back and sat with his hands folded, eyes forward, as if attendance alone were the point. Lucy arrived with her backpack bouncing and spotted him immediately. Her face lit up in recognition and then settled into something like focus. She did not run to him or call out. She went to the piano and adjusted the bench with care. The teacher stood nearby and nodded at me. The room filled with the ordinary sounds of learning pages, turning pencils, tapping the small coughs that announce effort. He did not watch Lucy constantly. He watched the room as if taking notes on how not to disturb it. I caught myself watching him, instead measuring his stillness against the memory of a man who once filled every space he entered. This one seemed intent on shrinking to fit when Lucy began to play scales. He did not smile or lean forward. He listened, the way people listen when they want to be worthy of the sound. The restraint pressed on me, because restraint implies intention, and intention asks for acknowledgement. I reminded myself that boundaries are not punishments. They are care made visible, and that my job was to keep the space safe, regardless of history. Halfway through the session, a parent asked about the funding, and I repeated the line. I had practiced, community support was being explored. Nothing was final. The words tasted like cardboard, but they held. Lucy finished and hopped down. Glancing back once toward the chair at the rear, he met her eyes and gave a small nod. No wave, no invitation, and she returned to her teacher. Satisfied that quiet exchange did something to my chest. I did not welcome. After the session ended, he stayed seated until the last child left, then stood and waited again. I expected a question or a confession. Instead, he asked where to place the extra chairs he had noticed stacked incorrectly. The mundane request caught me off guard. I told him the storage room was locked and thanked him. He accepted that and picked up trash from the floor, a simple act that felt earned because it asked nothing in return. Over the next weeks, the pattern held. He came. During posted hours, sat in the same place, helped with small tasks when invited, and left. When the lights dimmed, he did not ask for time. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not try to explain the past into a better shape. The steadiness made me uneasy because it removed my excuses. Lucy began to expect him without clinging to him. She checked for his presence with a glance, and then focused on her work. Children are precise observers. They notice consistency and trust. I noticed it too and resented that I did. One afternoon, I found myself rehearsing another set of rules in my head and realized I was afraid of what would happen if I ran out of them. Boundaries had given me control. Restraint was giving me information. The difference mattered. A city email arrived with a reminder about timelines and documentation. I forwarded it to the board and closed my laptop with more force than necessary. He watched from the back without asking. Later, he thanked the teacher and nodded to me before leaving. The courtesy felt heavier than confrontation as the door closed behind him. Lucy asked if he would be back next week. I said practice was open to the public, and she smiled as if that was a promise. I corrected myself silently because children hear what we intend. Even when we choose careful words that night as I locked up, I noticed the piano bench had been adjusted to Lucy's height and left there not moved for convenience or show. Just set for the next day, I stood in the quiet and understood the risk I was taking by allowing this rhythm to continue. Boundaries protect spaces, but they also create opportunities. Restraint can be a form of respect or a strategy. The only way to know is time. And time is expensive when funding is cut and hearts are tender. I wrote a note to myself about supervision and safety and then tore it up because it said nothing new. The truth was simpler and harder. He was doing exactly what I had asked, and the part of me that had expected a mistake felt unmoored. If he crossed a line, I would know what to do if he did not. I would have to decide what restraint deserved. The room would keep teaching me if I let it, and Lucy would keep asking questions that did not bend to policy. I turned off the lights and left the bench where it was adjusted for small hands and wondered how long a boundary can hold before it becomes a bridge. He kept coming without changing anything else, and that was the part that unsettled me most because power usually announces itself and he was choosing not to. Week after week, he took the same chair at the back, folded his coat the same way, and waited for the room to teach him how to behave. When a hinge squeaked, he oiled it after asking permission. When chairs needed stacking, he did it only after the teachers said yes. When a parent complained about schedules, he stepped aside so I could answer without his shadow complicating the moment the program limped forward on borrowed grace and small donations. And still, he said nothing about money, not a hint, not a suggestion, not even a question. I told myself this was manipulation by patience, that waiting can be a way of wearing someone down, but the theory fell apart under repetition. He did not escalate. He did not press. He did not arrive early or linger late. He respected closing time as if it were sacred. Lucy noticed all of it with the quiet accuracy children have. She stopped checking the door once she learned his rhythm. She stopped performing toward the back and began to play for herself again. That shift mattered. It meant she felt safe, not watched. And safety is not something you can buy with a check. One afternoon, the city email arrived again with deadlines bolded and warnings underlined. My stomach knotted and I carried the tension into the room without meaning to. Lucy stumbled through a scale and frowned. He did not rush to reassure her. He waited until she found her footing and nodded. Once the nod was enough, she tried again and succeeded. The lesson landed on me like a rebuke, presence without interference. Lets people finish their own work after class. I snapped at a printer that jammed, and he stood and held the door for a parent instead of offering help. He read the room and chose not to center himself. That choice kept happening small and precise, and it wore down my suspicion because suspicion needs evidence to feed on. I began to resent him for not rescuing us because rescue would have been simpler. Rescue would have let me keep my anger clean if he had written a check or made a call. The story would have sorted itself into roles I recognized: benefactor and beneficiary, savior and saved, but he refused the trope and left me with something messier: accountability. Lucy cut through my thoughts with a question asked sideways as she packed her bag. "Why does he listen like that?" she asked. I said, "People listen in different ways." She considered this and said, "Some people listen to fix things, and some people listen to stay." The distinction struck deeper than I expected. That night, I replayed her words and wondered which one I had been when I wrote the song the following week. A rumor spread among parents that a donor was coming. Glances flicked toward the back chair. I corrected it quickly and felt a sharp relief when he shook his head and looked down. He did not want credit for a thing he had not done. He did not want the story to tilt toward him. The program teetered and still he sat. My frustration sharpened into a question I could not ignore. If you have the power to help, why not use it? The answer arrived without words. One evening when Lucy stayed late to practice under supervision and missed the final bus. I called her mother and waited with Lucy by the door. He remained seated until I nodded that help was welcome. Then he stood and held the door open against the cold. He did not offer a ride or a solution. He offered a presence that did not complicate consent. Lucy talked about school and snacks and the way snow sounds different at night. He listened. The bus arrived and Lucy waved. He waved back and stepped away. No heroics, no spotlight, just the room returning to itself. Later, as I locked up, I caught my reflection and did not recognize the expression there. It was not anger or relief. It was a wary respect for a man who was choosing the harder path of not being needed. The city deadline loomed, and my phone filled with reminders. I expected him to break the silence with an offer he did not. Instead, he asked the teacher if the piano bench height could be marked for Lucy to avoid strain. The request was technical and kind, and it told me everything about his priorities. Lucy began to anticipate his presence not as a promise, but as a constant. She did not ask him questions meant to impress. She asked him the ones she saved for people who would not flinch one afternoon. She approached him during cleanup and spoke softly so only he could hear. I watched from across the room as her brow furrowed and his shoulders tightened. I did not know the words yet, but I felt their weight because questions asked in confidence change the shape of a place. He did not answer right away. He looked at me once to confirm the boundary and then knelt so he was level with her without touching whatever she asked, cracked something open. I saw it in the way he exhaled, slow and careful. The room held its breath again, not in anticipation of rescue, but in recognition of a truth being invited, and I knew that whatever Lucy had asked would not be solved by money or authority. It would be solved by staying present long enough to let the answer find its own way out. I knew the question had landed when Lucy stopped me with her eyes wide and unafraid and asked him why people leave before they finish listening and whether that made the song belong to anyone anymore, because the room went still and his face changed as if a door had opened inside him that he had been holding closed with care and discipline for years, while the teachers paused and the children pretended not to listen, and I felt my own breath stall because this was not a question meant for a child, but one that had waited patiently for him to answer without an audience and without the protection of authority, and he did not rush or deflect or correct her words, which told me that he understood the risk of truth spoken simply because children do not soften the edges for comfort. They ask what hurts and wait for the answer to stand on its own. And he knelt, so his eyes were level with hers, keeping space between them as we had agreed, and said slowly that leaving before listening was still a choice. And choices carry weight, even when they are made out of fear alone. And the word fear hung between us with a clarity that felt earned because it named what we had been circling without touching. Lucy considered this and asked if songs can forgive people who are scared. And he closed his eyes briefly as if counting to 10 before speaking again and said, "Songs forgive by being played honestly, which is harder than promising to stay and harder than apologizing." Well, and I felt my chest tighten because the answer was not for Lucy alone. It was for me and for the song that had refused to be buried, no matter how carefully I had packed it away. He did not cry, but his voice changed, and that was enough because men who learn to control rooms do not often let their voices tell the truth. Lucy nodded as if the answer fit where it belonged and returned to her music, and the room exhaled. I stood very still because I had just watched a child ask for accountability without accusation and receive it without defense, and that felt rarer than any funding promise could ever be. He rose and thanked the teacher and me, again keeping his eyes on the floor as if to avoid claiming more than he had earned, and when the class ended, he waited until the children left before standing. I felt the impact of the question settle into me like a slow ache, because it did not ask what had happened. It asked what would be done now, and that shift from story to choice is where things break or heal. I followed policy and walked him to the door, thanking him for respecting the rules, and he thanked me for holding them. We stood there for a moment with the cold coming through the glass, and he said he would return during open hours if that was still acceptable, and the care in his tone made me aware of how rarely men with power ask permission. Twice I said it was, and watched him leave without turning back that night. Lucy packed slowly and looked up at me with the same seriousness she had earlier and asked if people can practice staying the way they practice music, and the question felt like a hand on my back steadying me before a step I had been avoiding. I told her, practice is how things change, and she smiled as if that was permission enough. I locked up later with the lights low and the piano quiet, and felt the weight of what had shifted the question had broken something open in him, and it had broken something open in me too, because I could no longer pretend that restraint was enough by itself. Restraint is a start, but it is not a repair, and repair requires choice. Made again and again without applause, I understood then why the question had broken him. It did not accuse him of leaving it, asked him to stay honestly, and honesty costs more than checks or calls. It costs time and attention, and the risk of being seen, the city deadline pressed and the program still hung by a thread. But the room felt different, as if the song had given us language for what came next. I did not know how I would respond when the email arrived, or when the board called, or when money entered the conversation, but I knew the question would return because Lucy had placed it between us with care, and we would have to walk around it or through it together. Eventually, the next day, the email did arrive, and its subject line pulled the past into focus with a familiar coldness, and I felt the room tilt again because unfinished things do not wait forever. They choose their moment, and this one had been chosen by a child who listened closely and asked the only question that matters. The room felt smaller as I read and understood that what was about to break next would not be him alone, but the story I had told myself about why he left and why I had stayed silent for so long, waiting instead of choosing. And as I closed the laptop, I knew that the question Lucy asked had done its work. It had broken him open without shame, and it had broken me open without escape, and the space between us would now have to be crossed or honored with equal care. Either way, the song had asked us to finish listening, and I understood that answers do not arrive all at once. They arrive as choices made in rooms that watch closely and in moments when children are brave enough to ask what adults avoid and wait for us to answer. The email arrived the next morning with a subject line that looked harmless enough and felt anything but a forwarded chain from an old address I had not used in years. My name misspelled the way it used to be. The attachment labeled Demo Submission Review and a date that pulled the air from my lungs. I opened it, standing at the counter with a mug cooling in my hand, and read the words slowly, as if they might change. If I gave them time, not aligned with current branding, not recommended for further review, template language, clean and distant and final. My stomach dropped because the timestamp placed it squarely inside. The year I had finally worked up the courage to send my music into the world without my name attached, the year I told myself rejection would be easier than wondering, the year I promised I would accept the answer and move on. And now, the answer had a letterhead. I recognized his company, his orbit, his gravity. I sat down hard and let the mug go cold. The room felt smaller and louder all at once, memory rushing in with sharp edges. The nights I rewrote that melody until it breathed, the mornings I told myself it was enough to teach and build space for others, the careful lie that said my work had simply run its course. I read the email again and again until the words lost meaning and only the implication remained that something precious had passed through his world and been dismissed without him ever hearing it, or worse, with him hearing it and choosing to look away. Anger rose clean and hot and welcome, because it gave me a shape to move toward when he arrived that afternoon. During open hours, I was ready, not composed, but resolved. He took his seat at the back as usual and looked up when I approached, concern flickering and then settling into attention. I did not sit. I did not ask permission. I held out the printed email with hands that did not shake and watched his face as he read, watched confusion crease his brow and then give way to a deeper stillness. "This came from your company," I said, my voice flat and careful because if I let it rise, it would break. "I sent that demo years ago. I did not use my name. I wanted the music to stand on its own." He looked up slowly and shook his head. "Once, I never saw this," he said, not defensively, not quickly with the steadiness of someone stating a fact that hurts submission. "Team handles those templates go out automatically. I swear to you, I never heard it. The word swear scraped something raw, and I stepped back because oaths arrive too late to change outcomes. You walked away once, I said, and now I find out the last piece of me that tried again, passed through your world, and died there." The room felt too quiet. Teachers kept children occupied with soft instructions. Lucy was across the room, pretending to organize pencils and watching everything. He did not argue, he did not minimize. He did not claim ignorance as innocence. He took the weight and held it. "I understand why you would think that," he said, and the restraint that had once calmed me now felt like salt. "Understanding does not bring the music back." I said, "It does not give me back the years." I told myself it was over because I needed it to be. His shoulders tightened and he nodded. "You are right," he said, and that was the moment something collapsed, not because he denied me, but because he accepted the damage without asking to be spared from it. I felt the ground shift under my anger, and I grabbed the only solid thing left, my boundary. I told him he could not come back, not for now. Not while this sat between us. The words tasted bitter and necessary. He absorbed them without protest. "If that is what you need," he said, "I will respect it." Lucy's pencil fell and rolled toward my feet. I picked it up and placed it back on the table without meeting her eyes. The room finished its work and emptied slowly. He left first, pausing at the door as if to speak and then choosing not to. The restraint that once reassured me now hollowed the space he left behind that night. I replayed the email and the conversation and the years between them. I wondered if truth matters when timing fails it so completely. I wondered if the song had been kinder when it stayed hidden the next week. He did not come, and the absence rang louder than presence ever had Lucy noticed, and did not ask. At first, she practiced with extra care, as if precision could fill a gap. Then she looked at me and asked if he was gone, and I said yes, and hated how final it sounded. The program continued to fray at the edges. Deadlines pressed parents asked questions I could not answer, and still I told myself that removing him was the responsible choice that clarity required, distance that healing needed. Quiet, the email sat on my desk like a verdict, and I reread the line about branding until I wanted to tear the page in half. I told myself this was the midpoint where stories reveal what they are willing to lose, and I chose loss because it felt honest, but honesty does not always feel complete. Sometimes it just clears the room and leaves you alone with what you cannot put back. I closed the folder and locked the office and stood in the dark, listening to the building settle the piano bench still set to Lucy's height, the song resting behind a closed lid, and I wondered whether collapse is a failure or a passage, and which side of it I was standing on now. He did not come back the following week, and the quiet he left behind felt deliberate, like a promise kept at personal cost. The back chair remained empty, and the room learned a new shape without him. I told myself this was what boundaries were for, to restore order after collapse, to protect the children and the work from complications I could not afford, and still, the absence felt louder than his presence ever had. Lucy practiced with an intensity that bordered on stubborn, her shoulders set and her fingers precise. She did not look toward the door anymore, and that worried me more than longing would have when children stop looking. It is because they have learned to manage disappointment. The program limped forward on small mercies, a bake sale, a donation jar that filled slowly, parents offering rides and snacks and time. The city emails kept arriving, and I kept answering them with the same careful language inside. I carried the email like a stone, turning it over and over until the edges cut. Then the first package arrived with no return address. A thin envelope tucked between catalogs inside were photocopies of beginner sheet music marked with fingerings that matched Lucy's reach. Exactly, the notes circled where her hands tended to slip the margin reminders, gentle and practical. I recognized the handwriting immediately and felt my throat close. I did not share the pages with the teachers that day. I placed them in Lucy's folder without comment and watched her eyes widen when she found them. She looked around the room once and then smiled to herself. "He's still here," she said quietly, just quieter. The words landed like a truth I had not authorized but could not deny. The next week, a book appeared on the supply shelf. Not a gift bag or a note, just a used copy with a library stamp on music. Ergonomics for children highlighted in places that mattered. The librarian thanked me for the donation when I asked about it, and I nodded without correcting her. The room accepted the help without knowing its source, and that felt right. No credit to accept, no story to hijack. Lucy's playing loosened as if the pressure had eased. She made mistakes again and laughed at them. Safety had returned in a new form, one that did not depend on being seen. I tried to tell myself this was ideal, that quiet support preserved boundaries while meeting needs. But another part of me recognized the pattern for what it was, staying without claiming the hardest way to stay. A city deadline came and went with an extension granted, and then another. The board asked for revised budgets, and I worked late to prepare them one night. As I locked up, I noticed the bench had been adjusted again to Lucy's height. After a substitute teacher moved it, a small correction, done invisibly, my chest tightened with gratitude and resentment tangled together. Because gratitude accepts help and resentment resists obligation, and I did not know which one I was allowed to feel. Lucy asked fewer questions, but when she did, they cut straight to the center. She asked whether staying counts if people cannot see it, and whether quiet help still matters. I told her yes and meant it, even as I wondered if quiet can sometimes look like avoidance. The phone rang one afternoon with a parent asking if the rumor was true that the program might close early. I said nothing was final and hung up with my hands shaking. The next envelope arrived with a list of local grants and deadlines circled. No note, no signature, just information offered and released. I thanked the universe for anonymity and cursed it in the same breath because anonymity makes gratitude feel incomplete. Lucy tucked the list into her backpack and said, "We should try all of them." Optimism borrowed from a future she still believed in. The teachers noticed the materials and assumed a donor had stepped up. I corrected them gently and felt the truth slide between my fingers. He was helping without rescuing, staying without entering, respecting the line I drew while finding ways around the damage that line could not address the city. Man stopped by with a neutral smile and asked for updates. I gave them. He nodded and left the room. Exhaled that night as snow began to gather on the steps. I saw him across the street standing under the streetlight, not approaching, not signaling, just waiting for the room to empty before turning away. My heart kicked hard and then steadied. This was not intrusion, this was patience, chosen daily. Lucy noticed him too and did not wave. She slipped her hand into mine and squeezed once as if to say she understood the shape of things. Now the following morning, the third package arrived. This time a simple set of metronomes with a receipt taped inside, showing a return option, consent built into the gesture. I placed them on the shelf and watched the children discover them with delight, the room filled with ticking and laughter and work. I realized then that quiet, staying, changes the temperature of a place without demanding recognition. It does not fix everything, and it does not erase harm, but it creates conditions where repair can begin without spectacle. I sat at my desk and reread the email one last time before filing it away. Not to forget it, but to stop letting it narrate my days. Staying quietly does not absolve anyone. It invites the next choice, and as the room hummed with small, steady effort, I knew that the next choice would not be announced or dramatic. It would arrive the way help had arrived lately, folded into ordinary time, asking to be noticed without being named. Lucy's fever began as a warmth I tried to explain away with routine and hope. A flushed cheek at pickup, a quietness that did not match her usual bounce. I wrapped her in a sweater and promised myself I would check again after dinner by nightfall. The warmth had sharpened into heat, and her breathing turned shallow and fast. The room narrowed to the sound of her pulse and the clock on the wall. I called her mother and heard the panic mirror my own. We decided together and did not debate. I grabbed keys and a coat and drove through streets glazed with winter light. Lucy curled in the back seat, clutching her backpack like an anchor at the emergency room. The doors slid open, and the air smelled of antiseptic, and tired hope triage moved with practiced speed. Questions asked and answered, vitals, taken, masks placed gently. Lucy's small hand found mine and held. I stayed steady because children borrow calm, the way they borrow language. When the nurse guided us to a curtained bay and asked about insurance and contacts, my mind stumbled. I gave what I could and focused on Lucy's eyes. She asked if the piano would be okay without her, and I said yes because the truth mattered less than the promise of return. Minutes stretched and then folded when the doctor came with clear instructions and reassurance wrapped in caution. A respiratory infection, treatable, watch closely. We would stay for observation. The word stay landed like an answer I had not asked for yet. Paperwork followed and numbers I could not place floated at the edge of my vision. I stepped aside to make the call I had avoided in my mind for days. My thumb hovered and then pressed his name. I did not rehearse because rehearsal makes lies. He answered on the first ring and I said, "Lucy is sick and we are at the ER," and he said, "I am on my way," without asking where or why. When he arrived, he did not hurry into the bay or touch anything that required permission. He stood at the edge and waited for my nod. I gave it. He stepped in and spoke to Lucy with the same careful tone he used in the room. She smiled weakly and told him the metronome worked. He told her he was glad and then turned his attention to the nurse with questions about comfort and timing that respected process. He handled the forms quietly after Lucy was settled, insurance numbers found and copied, signatures given where needed. No bypassing, no favors, just attention paid to the unglamorous work that keeps a night from unraveling. Hours passed in the low hum of machines and the soft shuffle of staff. Lucy slept and woke and slept again. I sat with my hands folded and watched him sit across from me with his coat on his knees, close enough to be present and far enough to keep the boundary intact. When I shivered, he stood and draped his coat over my shoulders without a word. the gesture small and necessary and unclaimed. A nurse noticed and smiled the way people do when they recognize a story forming without spectacle. The doctor returned near dawn with good news, and a plan relief washed through me and left my limbs heavy. I thanked everyone and felt the words mean more because they were ordinary. As the sky lightened outside the windows, he asked if I wanted coffee, and I nodded. He returned with 2 cups and placed one within reach. The warmth steadied me. Lucy stirred and asked if we stayed, and I said yes. And she smiled later when the paperwork was finished and the numbers were written down. He said he would handle it, and I said no at first, out of reflex, and then yes, because refusing help for pride is not the same as keeping a boundary. He accepted my yes with the same care he had accepted my no. When the nurse asked who he was, I answered before thinking and then corrected myself, and we laughed softly at the truth of it. The morning brought discharge instructions and gratitude and fatigue. Outside, the cold felt clean. He walked us to the car and waited while Lucy was settled. She reached out and squeezed his hand and said thank you for staying, and he said, "You are welcome," without adding anything else. I watched that exchange and understood that staying is not a claim, it is a choice, renewed minute by minute when no one is watching on the drive back. Lucy slept, and the city slid past in quiet lines he followed at a distance until I waved him away. He respected that too. Later that day, when Lucy rested at home, I sat at the table with the discharge papers and the folded coat and felt the night settle into memory. The choice had been made without speeches or conditions. Not to forgive or forget, but to be present when it mattered, and I knew that whatever came next would have to be measured against that night, not against emails or funding or old stories, but against the simple fact that when the room narrowed to a child's breath and the clock on the wall, he had arrived and stayed and done the work that does not get named, and that knowledge changed the weight of everything that followed. After the night at the hospital, the rhythm of our days changed without announcement or agreement. Nothing was named and nothing was claimed, but the room adjusted as rooms do when they sense a new weight being carried. Lucy returned to practice slower at first and then steadier, her breath still catching on long phrases, and he arrived during public hours and took the same chair without ceremony. The teachers nodded to him the way they nod to fixtures that have proven reliable. Not warm or cold, simply present. He walked Lucy to the door only when invited and never farther. He waited while I spoke to parents and did not insert himself into conversations that were not his. He learned the bus schedule and stood back when it was late, offering company without solutions. Lucy began to speak of him in sentences that did not ask permission, not as someone she was excited about, but as someone she expected. "He stays," she said once while adjusting the bench, and the phrase carried a finality that made my throat tighten. Staying became the measure of things, not words or gestures or money. Staying when practice ran long. Staying when a meeting with the board went badly and the teacher's shoulders slumped. Staying when Lucy struggled with a passage and refused help. Staying when snow closed roads and the room felt smaller. I watched him practice restraint with the same care he practiced presence. Never correcting Lucy unless she asked. Never touching the piano unless invited. Never stepping into the role. Others tried to hand him. A parent joked once about adopting the program, and he smiled and deflected. Credit would have made things easier, and he refused it. The city emails continued, and the grant list grew longer. I worked late, drafting budgets and letters. Sometimes he would bring tea and leave it on the counter without comment. Sometimes he would not. The inconsistency was intentional and respectful. Lucy's mother thanked him once for being around, and he replied that he was glad to be useful and nothing more. The word useful mattered. It framed presence as service rather than ownership. Lucy began to teach younger children small warm-ups she had invented, her voice gentle and certain. I watched her kneel to meet them at eye level the way he had knelt to meet her modeling without instruction. I understood then that belonging does not need a title to be contagious. It spreads through behavior. One afternoon, a parent asked if he was Lucy's father, and I felt the question land like a dropped plate. He answered before I could. "No," he said kindly. "I am someone who listens here." The parent nodded and moved on. Lucy did not react, and that steadiness felt like success. We did not correct or clarify because clarity had already been offered the absence of a label. created space for trust to grow without pressure. I caught myself wanting to define it for my own comfort and resisted. Definitions can be cages when they arrive too early. The room thrived on its own terms. Attendants held small donations trickled in a local paper called About a Community Feature, and I declined attention, would have pulled focus from the work he supported that decision. Quietly, Lucy asked one evening why people like names so much, and I told her names help us feel safe, and she said, staying makes her feel safer. The answer landed like a verdict. Safety earned by repetition outlasts safety. Promised by titles. The board meeting arrived and went poorly. Timelines shortened and expectations sharpened. I returned to the room with my jaw tight, and he noticed and asked if help was wanted. I said no, and he accepted it. That acceptance mattered as much as any offer. He did not turn no into a future yes, or a quiet resentment. He simply stayed. Lucy practiced a new piece and stumbled and laughed and tried again. I felt the belonging settle deeper, not between two adults negotiating past harm, but around a child who had learned what to expect from the world: consistency, honesty, time. I realized then that belonging without title protects the child first. It removes the weight of adult definitions and lets the relationship breathe. When people belong without naming it, they are free to choose again tomorrow. That freedom kept the room light, even as pressures mounted one night as I locked up. Lucy tugged my sleeve and pointed to him waiting by the door and said, "He stays," and I nodded and said, "Yes, he does." And in that exchange, I accepted what had already been true. We had formed a shape that did not need explanation. It would not impress anyone or resolve our history, but it would hold. And holding is sometimes the most radical thing a place can do when everything else is uncertain. The piano bench remained set to Lucy's height. The lights clicked off in their familiar order. And as we stepped into the cold, I felt the quiet confidence that comes when belonging is practiced rather than declared, when presence is offered without demand, and when a child can name safety without learning the vocabulary of ownership. The night of the winter benefit arrived without drama, and that was its quiet power chairs, set in careful rows, a borrowed stage light warming the piano lid, paper snowflakes taped to windows by small hands that took the task seriously. The room filled with neighbors rather than donors, scarves and boots and familiar faces, the kind of crowd that knows how to sit close and listen. Lucy waited backstage with her sheet music folded thin from use. Her teacher knelt beside her and whispered reminders about tempo and breath. I stood a few steps away, feeling the hum of anticipation settle into my bones. He took his place behind me where he always stood now, not touching, not claiming. Simply present. The board members arrived and sat quietly. The city representative did not, which felt like a mercy. The lights dimmed and the chatter softened into that attentive hush that feels like trust. Lucy walked out with the careful confidence of someone who knows the room belongs to her. She adjusted the bench without looking, her hands finding the keys as if greeting friends. She turned once toward the audience and said her name, and thanked everyone for coming. Then she paused and added that the next song was one her mommy taught her and that it was for listening, not for perfection. A ripple moved through the room. I felt his breath catch behind me, and when she began the melody, it came back. Changed, not repaired, but deepened the wrong notes. Still there, the hesitations, honest, the pauses held a fraction longer as if the song itself had learned patience. I listened the way I had not allowed myself to listen before, without guarding the edges, without measuring the past against the present. The song no longer belonged to the summer I wrote it, or the man who left it belonged to the child who carried it forward with care. The audience did not applaud at the first turn or the second. They waited. They listened. The room leaned in together, and that collective attention felt like a hand at my back. I sensed him close without looking, his presence steady and unobtrusive. When Lucy reached the bridge, she faltered and then found her way, a small smile crossing her face. The room breathed with her when the final note settled. There was a moment of silence, so complete it felt like respect. Then, applause rose and wrapped around her without breaking the spell. Lucy stood and bowed and scanned the room until she found us, her smile quick and proud. He did not clap loudly or stand. He nodded once, eyes bright, the restraint still there but softened by joy. Backstage, Lucy hugged her teacher and then ran to me and asked if she did okay, and I said yes because the word carried everything it needed to. He stepped closer, but stopped short and waited for my cue. I turned and met his eyes and said, "You stayed the words simple and sufficient." He nodded and said I wanted to hear it finished. And in that exchange, we named the only thing that mattered after the crowd thinned and the chairs scraped back into stacks. People thanked Lucy and the teachers and offered envelopes with small donations. We accepted them with gratitude and placed them in the box. No speeches, no announcements. The song had done the work later. As we locked up the room, I felt the ache I had been carrying finally ease, not disappear, but soften into something I could hold. He lingered by the door until Lucy packed her bag. She asked if the song sounded different tonight, and I told her yes, and she asked why, and I said, because rooms change songs when they listen well. She considered that and said rooms should listen more. He smiled at that and then looked away as if to keep the smile from becoming a claim. Outside, the air was sharp and clean. Snow threatened, but held the streetlight cast a circle that felt intimate and public at once. He walked us to the curb and stopped there. Lucy hugged me and then him without asking, and he accepted the hug without tightening or loosening, simply present as if belonging had taught his body where to rest. She stepped back and said, "Thank you for listening," and he said, "Thank you for playing." We stood there a moment longer and then parted the night, closing gently around us on the drive home. Lucy hummed the melody under her breath and asked if songs ever come back to say thank you. I told her they do when we let them change later, as I sat at the table and counted the donations. I realized the measure of the evening was not the money or the applause. It was the way the song returned without demanding anything, how it found its place in a room that chose to listen, and how staying had turned an unfinished past into a present that could breathe. I did not know what tomorrow would ask of us or how the story would continue beyond this night, but I knew that the song had crossed the room and come back carrying something new, and that whatever came next would have to honor that quiet return, not with titles or promises, but with the same care that had brought us here, listening long enough to let the ending arrive on its own terms. 1 year later, the room no longer felt borrowed. The lights were warmer and the piano bore small scratches from honest use. The walls carried photos taken by parents who had learned to ask before sharing, and the donation box sat where it always had without a lock, because trust had become a habit. Here, the funding arrived in pieces rather than miracles. A local foundation approved a modest grant, the neighborhood association sponsored utilities for the Winter families, signed up for monthly contributions that fit their lives. Nothing flashy and nothing guaranteed beyond the next season, but enough to keep the door open and the bench adjusted to Lucy's height. Lucy grew into the space with a steadiness that felt earned. She taught younger children how to count rests and how to breathe through mistakes. She learned that helping does not mean hovering and that listening can be active work. He remained what he had always chosen to be here, present without title, useful without ownership. He fixed a broken hinge after asking and waited for approval before replacing worn felt under the pedals. He learned the rhythms of pickup and drop-off and stayed back when parents needed privacy. He attended meetings only when invited and spoke less than anyone else when he did. The room learned his shape and trusted it. I learned mine again too, not as the person who managed endings, but as the person who held space long enough for beginnings to find their feet. The email still lived in a folder and I did not delete it. Some records are not for reopening, but for remembering what silence costs when it resurfaced in my mind. I did not let it narrate the present. I let the present answer it. Lucy asked fewer questions about leaving and more about staying. She asked how long songs can last, and I told her as long as people keep playing them honestly. The winter benefit became a tradition without becoming a spectacle. Neighbors brought cookies and folding chairs in their listening. Lucy played other pieces, and sometimes that one never announced, never avoided, just included as part of the room's vocabulary. He stood behind me as always, and sometimes I leaned back just enough to feel the certainty of his presence. Without touching, that was enough. Belonging did not ask for proof anymore. One afternoon, a new parent asked how the program survived, and Lucy answered before I could. "We stayed," she said. The simplicity of it made the room smile. Staying had become the explanation and the ethic, not because it erased harm or rewrote the past, but because it refused to let the future be managed by it. On the first snow of December, Lucy hung a new paper snowflake by the window and wrote a note in careful letters for listening. She taped it where the light would catch it and stepped back to judge the balance. He watched from the doorway and nodded approval without moving. Later that night, after the children left and the teachers stacked chairs, he asked if there was anything else needed, and I said, "Not tonight," and he accepted that we walked to the curb together and stopped at the same place we always did. Lucy ran ahead to count the cars and then returned. She took his hand without asking and mine without looking and swung our arms once before letting go. She did not say any names. She did not need to. The streetlight framed us and then released us at home. Lucy practiced softly and asked if she could teach the song to a younger child next week. I said yes and felt the meaning of that. Yes, stretch beyond the schedule later. As I closed the room alone, I listened to the building settle and felt the belonging earned rather than granted. It had come from choices made without witnesses and nights when help arrived quietly and stayed until morning. It had come from a child who asked questions that cut clean, and adults who answered without hiding. It had come from refusing rescue and choosing presence instead. The piano bench remained set where it belonged, and the lights went off in their familiar order. I locked the door and stepped into the cold with the certainty that not everything needs a name to be real. Some things are finished only by being lived again and again with care. And as I walked home, I hummed the melody without counting bars and let it change with the air. Grateful that the song had not been rescued or redeemed, but listened to long enough to bring us all home. Before you click away, stay here with me for just a moment. Not because I want something from you, but because this story asked something of all of us. It asked us to listen longer than usual, to stay, when it would have been easier to move on. And if you are still here, it means some part of you recognized that feeling, the quiet weight of presence, the kind that does not announce itself or demand a name, the kind that simply stays stories. Like this are not about perfect endings or dramatic rescues. They are about ordinary choices made again and again, about rooms that become safe because people decide to be careful with each other, about children who ask honest questions and adults who finally stop avoiding the answers. If this story felt slow, that was intentional, because real healing is slow. If it felt quiet, that is because real connection rarely shouts. And if it felt familiar in a way you could not quite explain, it may be because you have lived a version of it yourself. Maybe you were the one who stayed. Maybe you were the one who left, or maybe you were the one who waited without knowing what you were waiting for. These stories are for you, not to teach or persuade, but to remind us that money does not save. What attention abandons, that titles do not create belonging, and that love is often proven not in what we promise, but in what we quietly show up for when no one is counting. If you felt your chest tighten at any point, if you found yourself holding your breath during the silences, if you recognized the courage it takes to respect boundaries instead of crossing them, then you understand why this channel exists. We tell stories like this because they reflect something true about the world we live in now, a world where many people are surrounded and still lonely, where noise replaces listening and where staying has become an underrated act of bravery. By subscribing, you are not signing up for spectacle or shock. You are choosing stories that move at a human pace. Stories that trust you to feel without being pushed. Stories that believe healing does not need to be loud, to be real. We post new stories regularly, each one different in detail, but united by the same promise to honor presence, to respect time, and to tell the kind of stories that leave room for reflection instead of rushing you to the next thing. If this story reminded you of someone, maybe a child, a partner, a moment you almost walked away from, consider sharing it. Not to explain anything, just to say, this mattered to me. And if you are watching alone, know that you are not alone in feeling this way. There are others here who value the same quiet truths, who believe that listening is an action and staying is a choice. Take whatever you need from this story and leave the rest. Let it settle, let it change, shape in your own time, and when you are ready, we will be here with another story, another room, another moment where something unfinished finds the courage to be heard. Until then, stay kind, stay present, and remember sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply not leave.